There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, B, and thank you for having me here. At sort of the tail end of the bio that B read, I joined the staff of Denver Urban Gardens a little over 2 years ago, and on the heels of a teaching career and a few other things. And so for the last 2 years, I've been really deep into the kind of work that I'm going to talk about here. And I wanted to give a little bit of background about Denver Urban Gardens, and it's going to be a pretty big, I think, not philosophical shift, but real different than what Ross was talking about, and I think a really interesting complementary way. So I'm excited to follow that presentation. So I called this Food, Water, Plants, and People because we want to be water-wise, but we're also people, and wherever we live, we need food. We need to grow local food. I think that's a really important thing that is, of course, becoming more and more popular again. And crucially, this isn't a one-to-one correlation, but food means water, especially when it comes to plants. A little bit more water is going to give you more food production, and plant selection can get you a whole lot farther in terms of drought tolerance, and things are going to produce more food with less water. But so I really want to think about how are we focusing our efforts if we're going to water, if we're going to irrigate at all, let's irrigate our food. And what does that kind of mean in relationship to the rest of our landscapes? And what are some of the techniques we can use beyond plant selection that are going to get us a lot farther with the water that we do use? So Denver Urban Gardens has been around since the 1980s as an established 501c3. And it's developed the largest independent network of community gardens. There are some community garden networks in the country that have more community gardens, but they're usually run by parks departments. So Doug is completely independent as a nonprofit, and we work in 6 counties in Metro Denver. We have over 200 gardens and food forests. So we serve all kinds of different people who grow in different contexts for different reasons: beauty, relaxation, food, seed saving, et cetera, et cetera. I was brought onto the organization to start and lead our food forest initiative, the Etkin Family Food Forest Initiative. We're in our 3rd year, and this is basically taking the idea of growing food in community in urban spaces and broadening it to perennials and turning sort of marginal areas and areas that often are just used for turf right now or are unused lots into public access spaces where people are growing, where we are establishing and other people are growing and maintaining multifunctional perennials at all levels, right? Root crops and ground covers and herbaceous perennials and shrubs and trees. And they have all kinds of these different benefits, and I included this graphic that we have on some of our signage because, first of all, you'll notice that all the plants are touching. I love that Ross said that. We don't need to be having this, anytime you see spacing recommendations on your seed packets or your perennials, throw them out. Get them bunched closer, I think almost universally. But I'm also going to be talking about some of the topography. You'll notice that there is landform and contour in where these plants are placed. So I want to talk about not just what we're selecting, but again, how we're planting and where we're focusing those efforts. So the kind of 4 things that I want to really focus on here are landform, to do passive water harvesting and reducing evaporation, mulch, which I'll get into a little bit more, but non-cedar, non-painted, locally sourced mulch, and also what's the difference between food-bearing plants versus non-food-bearing plants, and what kind of mulch and soil are they looking for, and then this idea of food forest islands, and then a couple of species that I would recommend if you're looking at bringing a little bit more food into your home landscapes, your community landscapes. So landform, first of all, this picture on the left is from Brad Lancaster's work, Rainwater Harvesting. He has a couple books on this. He's out of Tucson. And basically we're thinking about trying to direct water into our landscape and to mimic the natural forms of the landscape. So anywhere that you see a lot more like larger trees and shrubs in our region, and certainly most of the food-bearing shrubs like our native plums or service berries we'll get to, or currants, a lot of times those are actually in depressions and dips. They are in riparian areas, so they're near streams and lakesides. So if we want to kind of mimic that the best we can, we want to either find areas that look like that or create them. The picture on the right is one of the sunken planting basins that we do at all of our food forests with Doug, where we actually bring volunteers out and we create these kind of big dinner plate depressions where we're going to actually plant our shrubs and trees. Again, that's, I don't know if anybody's gone out after a rainstorm. Maybe, we have these thunderstorms and then it clears up. It's nice and dry and sunny, but you look around and there are areas of wetness. Sometimes it's just any little divot in the land, you're going to see a lot more moisture. So it doesn't have to be like a huge sunken hole, but any bit of a shift in that topography is going to retain moisture and reduce evaporation quite a lot. So we can create these things, or we can find areas that already have those attributes before we even start to plant. And actually, to stay here for a moment, and I'll talk about this more when we get to the islands idea, but what's inside and outside of this planting basin is really significant. So I'm going to recommend a lot of our food-producing plants go inside the basins, and a lot of the plants that Ross was talking about, some of these incredible, beautiful, drought-tolerant, pollinator-friendly perennials, they can go around the outside and nearby, and they're all going to support each other if we do that in the right way. Quick note on mulching. So a lot of, again, just to contrast and compare, a lot of the native plants, a lot of the xeric plants, and so I imagine many of the plants that Ross was just showing, don't actually like a ton of organic matter. But food-producing plants generally do. So if we're introducing food-producing perennials, we want to actually increase organic material. So using, Colin Arborist, use Chip Drop, which is a website where you can get huge dumps of chipped up trees. That's a way to get non-cedar, non-painted mulch. So it's going to decompose, it's going to add nutrients, and it's going to hold water in the landscape and add organic material over time and come back as food. This is taking, redirecting a waste stream, and I don't recommend putting this mulch everywhere in your landscape, because a lot of the plants that thrive on lower water, actually they really appreciate things like gravel mulch and lower organic matter in the soil. So you don't want to do, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if we have this resource already that arborists are paying to throw away, and they're often sometimes being recycled, but often being thrown away, we can repurpose that and bring it into our landscapes and turn it back into food. I would also say, if you are mulching perennials, go wider and deeper than you expect. Trees, especially in our climate, achieve greater drought tolerance by spreading out their lateral roots. So there's the drip edge of the tree. We want to go farther out. A lot of times trees and shrubs have roots that are twice the diameter of the edge, the drip edge of the tree. So all of that can be is area that can be fed by the mulch and also that can retain moisture. And the deeper that you do that, the faster it's going to compost. So again, this is about thinking about our intensivity and where we do that. So this is a drone shot of a preparation, a soil preparation that we did at a food forest just a few weeks ago in Park Hill. And you'll notice that these are all of our planting basins. They're all heavily mulched inside. We'll figure out what we're doing with all the interstitial grass area. This is on a school, so we're going to be killing the grass in a few different ways there, partly by just starving it, also mulching over time. Sometimes we do sod removal. But the main point here is that I do not advocate planting an entire field with food-producing plants in Colorado. Again, we're mimicking the forest islands and the kind of the savanna look. Right? So even on the plains, our ecology here is more of a savanna where you might have one tree or two trees per acre. And so within that, let's focus our efforts and have more intensive planting in there. So we can get the most benefit from each of those instead of spreading it out and spreading our water resources and trying to do too much. All right, now I want to get to this. I tend to have some issues with the term native. You can take this or leave it. I recognize that native plants are important for native ecology and habitat, and that plants that take over and species that dominate and exclude other species and cause imbalance in the ecology, that's very real. However, what's native is always changing. That's never going to be more true than it is in the next 100 years. So, and it's also changed a whole lot in the last 200 with settler colonialism throughout North America. So along with that comes disruption and a hybridization of our landscape. So yes, we want to have a support of what is already here, look to what's ahead, and think about what's adapted. I actually really loved, Ross tossed out a term, I'm pretty sure he said sister step regions, which I love, right? So this is the idea of other regions around the world that are similar to our region. So we can actually use these climate analogs to figure out, well, what grows there, how do they grow it, what's adapted, and what sort of lessons can we learn, especially if we start to become hotter and drier in time. Along with that, remember, we're thinking cold, dry, continental climate, quick transitions between seasons, wide variation of temperatures. These are the places that we're similar to. We have a food forest that's near a garden that's primarily Russian and Ukrainian immigrants. And when we had our community input meeting, they talked about how important sour cherries or tart cherries are in Eastern European culture. I was like, well, that's fantastic, because tart cherries grow really well here. Sweet cherries don't. And that's because we're not that dissimilar from Eastern Europe and the steppes of Eastern Europe and Ukraine. So we planted a lot more tart cherries as part of that food forest because we knew that that was going to serve the people there, and they were going to be more in tune with the needs of those plants because they were actually going to use them. And so I think this is a really key thing where when you're doing your research, and I know that Plant Select and the gardens are the botanic gardens are an amazing place to go and see different variations of climate in one spot. But I know that people are pulling from this idea, and I think it's really helpful to help bridge our thinking between multiple generations. Because when we're talking about perennials, especially trees and shrubs that can live for 20, 30, 40, 80, 100 years, we actually have to think generationally and have to think about the movement of the climate, not just what it has been now or what it was 300 years ago when people first started classifying native. Another thing that you can use when you're thinking about perennials, and this is, I work for Denver Urban Gardens. And some of you may live right in Denver in a very urban context, some of you may not. But I like to think about what do we get from the urban heat island effect? And what do we get from the high diversity of plants and yards and people all moving around? And what do we especially get from lots of impermeable surfaces? I really want to highlight the third bullet point the most. In an urban context, we actually have a lot of excess water. This is going to be a little bit, I feel like I'm speaking dangerous words in the halls of power. Right, and there's complicated things about water law, and where all of those gutters go to the alleys, to the sewers, to the eastern plains, and water law, and 150 years of accumulated stuff that we're still working out. But there's a lot of extra water in an urban context. So if we can find ways to make smart use of it, we're actually going to be reducing our stormwater runoff. We're going to be improving our landscapes, and we're going to be able to kind of shift our resources where they're most valuable. A couple plants to think about that I want to highlight, and I've got a longer list as well. So serviceberry, if you don't know this plant, this I think should be in every landscape in the Front Range. This is a native plant. It's also known as Saskatoon or Juneberry. This is really heavily used as a landscaping plant. And I also want to really highlight the importance of selected varieties. Of course, Ross was talking about the sucker punch choke cherry, which is going to reduce your maintenance load without having the suckers. Well, if you get a service berry that is, yes, a native plant, but that is selected for fruit production, you're actually going to have these plants that are just dripping with berries that are essentially blueberries. Blueberries don't grow in our climate. I'm sure most of you would know that. They don't grow well in our soils, I should say. But service berry pretty much does the same thing, and you can use it in a very, very similar way. And it thrives here on much less water. And a lot of times you can just find them walking around in your neighborhood because they're used as landscaping plants, but they just don't fruit very heavily. If you get a selected variety, you can change all of that. There's a really wonderful essay that I would suggest that you look up by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, about the service berry and kind of the incredible array of benefits that it gives in terms of habitat and pollinators and uses for humans as well.
Could you repeat that?
Yes, her name is Robin Wall Kimmerer, Kimmerer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrasses, which is her famous book, but there's an essay on serviceberry that's really beautiful.
Is it in that book?
It's not in that book. It's not a part of it. It's a separate essay. So yeah, we include these in all of our food forests. And we have a few selected varieties we're getting from places like Minnesota. And for whatever reason, I'll get to this also, for whatever reason, I do find that a lot of our local nurseries are this isn't universal, but a lot of them are a couple steps behind when it comes to food-bearing plants. They're doing incredibly well with ornamentals and pollinator-friendly plants, but there are really good and selected varieties coming out around the country that a lot of times our local nurseries aren't carrying. So there's ways to bridge that gap, and we're working on that as well at Doug. So the whole ribes family is great. So on the far right, you have the golden currant, which is the native currant you might see at the base of ponderosa pines up in the hills. It's a great complement. It can thrive in part, any of this genus can thrive in part shade as well as full sun. So I think I arranged the pictures in sort of a goofy way because on the right is the golden currant, and then on the center and the left, the center is gooseberry, and on the left is a black currant. Also there's yosta berries. These are all different varieties and cultivars of different species of ribes. Gooseberries have much bigger berries, but they have thorns. And then currants have no thorns but smaller berries. Currants and gooseberries will need a little bit more water than the native currant, but they're also going to tend to produce a little bit more. So you can kind of work with your situation and figure out, well, how far along this food production intensivity do I want to go? This is another really easy one to add. And yeah. My favorite is black currant. If you rub the leaves, it smells like pine. It's amazing. Although it's kind of divisive. Black currants, some people, it's almost like a cilantro thing. Some people really dislike black currants. I wanted to bring up bush cherries. So there's two that are represented here. The picture on the left is of a Nanking cherry. This is a bushing type tart cherry from northern China, Mongolia, that part of the world, and it's got a smaller bushing habit. The cherries, there are some different selected cultivars. They can be really good. They're not always very good, but they thrive really well. I actually see this like a really easy. This is probably on the lower water side of things. On the right are a series of cherries that are essentially tart cherry trees in a bushing habit. This is more an agricultural product, but they're doing really well at all of our food forests that we've planted so far. You also hear them called like the Romance series because they're called Romeo and Juliet, and I think there's one called Cupid. But they're really prolific. They do, again, require water if you're going to be expecting a really big crop. But they're incredibly cold tolerant and really tough. So that's one that I'd recommend. And you can see, I don't know if you can see the person, there's like hands behind that picture on the right. So they stay a little bit lower. They get a little bigger than that, but not too much. You know, 6 to 8 feet tops. I also really wanted to talk about jujubes. This is a tree that you can find a couple examples of at the Botanic Gardens. This is also known as the Chinese date. Again, comes from Mongolia. And you can find dried jujubes in some of the Asian supermarkets around the metro area. Incredibly drought tolerant, very pest resistant, and you couldn't grow them in the Front Range until the last couple decades because it used to get too cold. It doesn't get cold, and it doesn't quite get cold enough to kill them anymore. There are also jujubes in trials at New Mexico State University doing more adapted varieties for North America. But this seems to be a really well-adapted perennial that can fit a bunch of different needs. And still, you know, it's a little bit thorny when it is young. The thorns go away as it grows. And this is something that I very much think of in the realm of climate resilience crop. So thinking for the next 50 years, not the past 50 years. Where am I at? Okay, so we plant more fruit trees than this in our food forest, but these are kind of the core ones. There are apples and pears up here. I just want to this is when I was talking about varieties. If you're going to do this and you're going to focus some of your irrigation on that, fire blight resistance. Find a variety that is fire blight resistant and double check it through anything you need, because apples and pears are very vulnerable to that. We don't have, many of our local nurseries are not carrying a lot of the new varieties that are heavily fire blight resistant, and I don't know why. So people say, I'm going to plant a bunch of these natives, and I'm going to do one apple tree, and then it dies the next year because it got fire blight, because it's a variety that's 80 years old and isn't resistant to fire blight, and then people give up on apples. You don't have to. So I'll just make that kind of plug. We plant mostly European plums because they bear so much more heavily than American plums. We do also plant American plums in and around our food forest because they're amazing for pollinators. They still give off food, but again, if we're thinking about irrigating and adding at least some water to some places, we want to have more food for people. Plums tend to do better here than in a lot of other places. I mentioned the tart cherries and jujubes, and everybody says mulberries make a mess, and I know they make a mess, but they're almost effortless to take care of. Most of the effort after you establish a mulberry, you often don't even really need to irrigate them much. They feed the birds, they feed you if you get there quick enough. I know they make a purple mess and the birds poop purple for months, but a mulberry. Again, find a selected variety, otherwise you'll have a 60-foot tall white mulberry that's not that. So finding food sources, there's a lot of really great innovation in a variety of places. These are some of the companion plants that we use. You'll notice that some are natives, like the buffalo berry, false indigo. It's a little bit native to east of here, and lead plant. Those are great nitrogen fixers and pollinator aids that we add. But these are some of the main berries. And then we also like to have these kind of understory plants that if you're going to be watering your shrubs and trees at all, you're going to be watering the horseradish that's there, maybe the rhubarb, right? These things that you actually don't even have to add supplemental water, especially if you've planted them in a bit of a depression and you've added some organic mulch. I am growing hundreds of species of edible plants in my yard in Barnum. This includes fruit trees and hazelnuts and root crops and all kinds of different things. And my little graph from Denver Water is like 30% of the efficient use. So you do not have to break the bank either water-wise or dollar-wise to get productivity as long as you're focusing those efforts. And lastly, so just people always ask about sourcing. Harlequin's up in Boulder has some good stuff. Certainly a lot of really great kind of edge between native xeric and some fruit producing. The tree farm does as well. We're starting to sell more of the kind of stuff that we're planting in our food forests through our plant sale, which is May 10th and 11th. Come check us out. But also, a lot of the stuff, I really like these three nurseries. especially the first one, Burnt Ridge out of Washington, just because they're always bringing in new varieties. There's lots of good explanation of things, and they are out of state. But I think that what I've found is that if you're as long as you're kind of going through this rubric of, well, what's the zone and what's the water, we can actually be bringing in some things that are going to help increase the productive diversity of our landscapes for a long time to come. So we don't have to just wait on local nurseries. Feel free to, I know we're going to get to questions later. This was a copied slide. Don't ask questions now. But that's my email. Feel free to reach out or come to any of our planting days. We have planting volunteer days. We have lots of ways to get involved at Doug. You can also go to the website, dug.org. And if you find our food forest page, you can go, there's a map of our 20 sites. We're adding 4 more this spring. You can find any of them and kind of drop by and see what the process is like and what it's looking like in those sites. And get involved at any of our volunteer days or our different workshops. But yeah, I hope to see you there. And thanks so much for your attention.